beginning of the 5th century BC, the Achaemenid Empire and the Greek city-states were embroiled in a series of conflicts over the control of the Hellenic archipelago. In 490 BC, the Persian endeavor to conquer Greece was shattered at the Battle of Marathon, when they were seriously defeated by the armies of Athens. However, the Achaemenid expansionist desire was far from quenched. 10 years later, in 480 BC, Persian Emperor Xerxes I gathered a vast force of 250,000 men and a massive fleet of 1,200 ships and began preparations for an invasion of Greece. The Hellenic city-states, otherwise prone to quarreling with each other, had resorted to forming an alliance to face the Achaemenid threat. The cities of Sparta and Athens led the coalition, in charge of directing the land armies and the joint fleet respectively. Considering the route that Xerxes would have to follow to enter mainland Greece, the Hellenic alliance decided on a double standoff. The land army, under Spartan command, would hold off the Persian host at the Thermopylae Pass, while the joint fleet, under Athenian direction, would meet the enemy ships at the Strait of Artemisium. However, when the time to march to war arrived, Sparta was celebrating both the religious festivity of the Carneia and the Olympic Games. These occasions forbade the Spartans to go to war, but the gravity of the occasion allowed the Laconians to make an exception. King Leonidas of Sparta assembled an elite force of 300 Hippes, the elite royal guard, and marched out of the city, towards the chosen site of battle. Despite the fact that the 300 Spartan warriors are the most known Greeks who fought at the Thermopylae Pass, King Leonidas gathered thousands of warriors from many other city-states along the way. When the Hellenic army arrived at the site of battle, its strength amounted to 7,000 men from an amalgamation of different cities. The famed Spartans would be joined by Thebans, Phocians, Corinthians and Arcadians, as well as by fighters from many other places in Hellas. The Greek army was mostly made up of hoplites, a kind of heavy infantry warrior bearing a round shield, hefty thorax protections, and donning menacing helmets topped by crests and other adornments. At the other side of the pass, the colossal Persian force lay camp. Modern estimations set their numbers around the 200,000 mark. The camp of the invading force must have been dreadful to contemplate, extending wide along the Greek coastline. Despite the fact that the Achaemenid warriors were more lightly armored in general, the difference in strength was of several orders of magnitude. However, King Leonidas remained undeterred, and stoically commanded his men to occupy their posts. Upon witnessing the sheer mass of the enemy force, Leonidas had ordered his men to construct multiple campfires in the surrounding areas to kick up as much smoke as possible to conceal the far fewer Greek numbers. Meanwhile, King Xerxes had sent forth scouts and emissaries to attempt to negotiate with the Greeks. However, King Leonidas had no intention on coming to terms with the Persians. He was stalling the inevitable clash for as long as he could, allowing his men to fully prepare for what was about to come. The first Achaemenid wave consisted of 10,000 soldiers, most of them lightly armored infantry, though there was no shortage of archers either. The Greeks awaited them in a phalanx formation, their shields interlocked in a shining porcupine of flesh and bronze. As the Persians closed in, heavy fighting unleashed. From behind the infantry, the Achaemenid archers released volley after volley of arrows, spraying the Hellenic line with their deadly projectiles.
Battle positions!
In spite of the incessant pressure of their foe, the Greeks held their line stoically. The narrow pass negated the numerical superiority of the attackers, in such a way that Leonidas's men were able to rotate between the front and the rear, always making sure the troops in the front ranks were fresh and battle-ready. Persian archers loosed arrows overhead into the advancing Spartan lines. The bronze wall of shields held firm against the onslaught. Right before another wave of Persian infantry would clash, the Greeks would quickly disengage and draw the Persian infantry away from their main force. Isolated and in a head-on fight, the light Persian infantry were being massacred against the far superior and heavily armored Spartan hoplites. They were simply no match in a head-on engagement against the vast sea of bronze-armored warriors who fought for the very freedom of their homeland and livelihoods. No matter how heavy the push, the Greek phalanx held the line, and the waves of attacking Persians eventually desisted. Considering the failure of this first assault, King Xerxes decided that he should soften up the enemy before assailing them again. Therefore, an ample force of Achaemenid archers were sent to harass the static defenders. Thousands of arrows filled the air, raining over the hoplites, who entrusted themselves to their hefty shields. The heavy Greek shields were remarkably effective at deterring the Persian arrows. However, a few managed to slip through and inflict minimal casualties. Once Xerxes was satisfied with the shower of projectiles, he sent forward the elite of his army, a 10,000-strong corps of heavy infantry, nicknamed the Immortals. These men were the closest to matching the Greek armor and equipment of the hoplites, and fell on the phalanx with terrible violence. Under the push of the elite enemy infantry, Leonidas resorted to a deceitful strategy to win the day. He commanded his forces to feign a retreat, luring the first lines of Immortals to break their formation and give chase. Then, the Hellenic hoplites regrouped and reformed the line, meeting the dispersed Persians in a cohesive formation. Leonidas continued to rotate his soldiers, preventing them from fatiguing and ultimately losing their full fighting effectiveness. The Persian Immortals, however, were better trained, armed and skilled than their previous comrades, and were putting up a much tougher fight against their Greek foes. Ultimately, the superior Greek tactics and fighting prowess would prove to be pivotal in this engagement. The result was so devastating that the Immortals retreated, and King Xerxes called off the attack for the day. The Persians had suffered heavy casualties, whilst the Greeks, in contrast, had suffered minor casualties, and were now more confident than ever in their defensive position, having already held back multiple Persian attacks throughout the day. On the second day, King Xerxes once more commanded the assault on the pass, expecting the enemy to be too exhausted or wounded to hold. The assaulting Persian infantry was met by the other Greek soldiers. The Thebans, Thespians, and Arcadians, who had all primarily remained at the rear during the fighting the day before. This gave the Greeks a fresh fighting force, and simultaneously allowed the battered Spartans time to rest and tend to their wounded. The larger Persian force, along with the Immortals, proved to be more than a match for the other Greek factions. The Greeks began losing the fight and casualties began mounting. Leonidas acted quickly and sent contingents of his elite Spartan hoplites to fill the gaps that had opened up. Before long, the king himself with all of his Spartan troops were forced to once again fight the Persians head-on. The arrival of Leonidas and his Spartans proved once again to be the Achilles heel of the Persians, putting their advance to a halt and going on the counter-offensive, his hardy soldiers cutting their way through the Persian ranks with their iron-tipped spears and their razor-sharp Xyphos swords. Both proved to be greatly effective against Persian armor. With the intervention of the Spartan hoplites and the king of Sparta himself, the phalanx was able to resist the enemy advance, and once more, the Achaemenid forces retreated. Who knows how many more days could the Greeks have held the pass, if it wasn't for the fact that a Thessalian traitor informed the Persian leadership of a mountainous trail that would allow them to outflank the Thermopylae and appear at Leonidas's rear. On the night of the second day of battle, after the Achaemenid assault had been called off, a force of Persian immortals ventured into the trail, routing the slim Phocian detachment who stood guard. The road was open for the flanking maneuver. On the third day of battle, right before sunrise, King Leonidas was informed of the fleeing of the Phocians and of the inexorable enemy encirclement. The standoff at the Thermopylae was a lost battle. The Spartan king then decided that most of the army should retreat to fight another day, since now it was certain that the Persian armies would venture into Greece. However, the king himself, alongside his 300 Hippes, would stay behind to cover the retreat of the Hellenic forces. The Thespians and Thebans refused to retreat as well, deciding to stand next to the Spartans to cover their retreating allies. And thus, as the sun came up on the third day of battle, the bulk of the Greeks departed, while a force of 2,000 remained at the pass, spearheaded by the 300 Spartans and their proud king. While the Immortals traversed the mountain trail, the tide of Persian infantry once more fell upon the hoplite phalanx. The Spartans, Thebans, and Thespians that remained fought fiercely, and to their last breath. They fought until their spears were broken, then unsheathing their swords and continuing the battle. The hoplites managed to cleave through several waves of Achaemenid infantry, but this time the enemy numbers were too overwhelming. The Greeks fought to the last man, until their very leader, King Leonidas of Sparta, was stricken down. A few hundred Greek hoplite survivors retreated to an elevated hilltop where they had planned to make a final stand. The Persians, however, wanted to put a swift end to this otherwise major setback they endured. As opposed to lose any more of their men, they opted to unleash a continuous hailstorm of arrows into the ranks of the last remaining Greeks, ultimately killing them all where they stood. The battle was now officially over. King Xerxes had won the Battle of Thermopylae and had annihilated the 2,000 hoplites that had remained to hold the pass. Now, the road to mainland Greece was open. However, this victory had come with a heavy cost. The Achaemenids had lost roughly 20,000 men, which were inconceivable losses for the size of the Hellenic host. Anyhow, after the defeat at Thermopylae, the Greek fleet at Artemisium retired, and King Xerxes plunged into Hellas. However, his forces would be soundly defeated at the later battles of Salamis and Plateau, putting an end to the Persian aims of conquest in the archipelago. On the other hand, the stoic last stand of King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans is remembered as the noble sacrifice that allowed the Greek counterattack, and would go down in history as an example of selflessness and bravery. Even till this very day, tales and stories are retold of the heroic events that occurred on the plains of Thermopylae,